Avdiivka's importance was not because of what it contained, but because of where it stood. Located immediately north of Donetsk, the city sat astride the northern approaches to a regional hub that Russian-backed forces had controlled since 2014, and which Moscow had later claimed through formal annexation. As long as Avdiivka remained in Ukrainian hands, Russian forces operating in and around Donetsk were denied the ability to treat the city as a secure rear area. Ukrainian artillery units had range of logistics routes, ammunition depots, and troop concentrations, while drone launches from Avdiivka maintained constant surveillance over movements that Russian planners would otherwise have preferred to conceal. In military terms, therefore, Avdiivka was a thorn embedded not in the front line, but in the assumed depth behind it, and over time that made its existence intolerable to Russian command. This dynamic did not emerge suddenly in 2023. It was the product of nearly a decade of unresolved warfare in eastern Ukraine, during which Avdiivka had evolved from a modest industrial town into a fortified salient whose continued resistance had imposed a permanent operational cost on Russia. Unlike cities that were abruptly dragged into the full-scale invasion in 2022, Avdiivka had lived under fire since 2014, and that prolonged exposure had shaped both the city and the forces defending it. The siege that unfolded between October 2023 and February 2024 was therefore not a spontaneous escalation, but the final expression of a conflict that had been smouldering for years. So join us as we explore the conflict of the Battle of Avdiivka. Welcome to Wars of the World. When armed conflict erupted in Ukraine's Donbas region in 2014, following Russia's annexation of Crimea, Avdiivka found itself immediately adjacent to the front line. Donetsk fell under the control of Russian-backed separatist forces, while Avdiivka remained under Ukrainian authority, creating a fault line that would never truly stabilize. Early fighting was chaotic and fluid, but as front lines hardened after the Minsk agreements, Avdiivka became a permanent contact zone, exposed to artillery fire, sniper activity, and probing assaults. It was during this period that the foundations of Avdiivka's later resistance were laid. Ukrainian forces gradually transformed the city into a depth-based defense system, rather than a single line of resistance. Trenches expanded outwards into surrounding fields and industrial zones. Positions were reinforced with concrete. Shelters were designed not merely to protect from shrapnel, but to allow troops to survive sustained bombardment and then return to the fight. And crucially, fallback lines were constructed, with the explicit assumption that forward positions would eventually be lost, and that orderly withdrawal under fire would be preferable to annihilation. The Avdiivka coke and chemical plant became central to this defensive architecture. One of the largest industrial facilities of its kind in Europe, this plant consisted of massive reinforced concrete structures, thick walls, and an internal network of service tunnels and corridors. Designed to withstand industrial accidents, it proved exceptionally resilient under artillery fire. Over time, Ukrainian forces integrated this plant into their defensive system, using it as both a strongpoint and a logistical hub, allowing movement under cover and providing shelter during heavy bombardment. By the time Russia had launched its full-scale invasion in February 2022. Avdiivka was no longer simply a town with soldiers in it. It was now a fortress that had been shaped by years of adaptation, testing, and survival. The opening months of Russia's full-scale invasion in 2022 were marked by rapid advances, chaotic fighting, and dramatic reversals elsewhere in Ukraine. Avdiivka did not fall during this opening phase. Russian forces attempted to apply pressure in the Donetsk sector, but they failed to dislodge Ukrainian defenders from the city. As the front stabilized late in 2022 and into 23, Avdiivka remained a Ukrainian-held projection into Russian-controlled territory. But this persistence had consequences. Ukrainian artillery continued to disrupt Russian operations around Donetsk, while the city's mere existence undermined Moscow's narrative of control. Over time, the Russian command increasingly viewed Avdiivka as both a military liability and a political embarrassment. Other offensives, particularly around Bakhmut, had demonstrated that Russia was willing to accept enormous casualties in order to achieve limited objectives. And by mid-2023, Avdiivka had emerged as the next such objective, not because it promised a decisive breakthrough, but because leaving it untaken imposed a constant operational tax. Preparations for an assault were gradual and deliberate. Russian forces accumulated artillery ammunition, repositioned their units, and studied Ukrainian defensive patterns. There was no expectation of a rapid collapse. The plan was to dismantle the salient over time through attrition, encirclement pressure, and the systematic destruction of their defensive depth. Avdiivka's physical layout shaped every aspect of the coming battle. The northern sector was dominated by the coke plant, whose industrial scale made it resistant to conventional shelling. South and east of the plant lay residential districts of Soviet-era apartment blocks, interspersed with warehouses, rail embankments, slag heaps, and industrial ruins. Open ground between these features was limited, and often covered by pre-registered artillery fire. For armoured forces, this environment was deeply unfavourable. Roads and access routes funneled vehicles into narrow corridors, where mines, anti-tank guided missiles, and artillery could easily be employed with devastating effect. Infantry assaults were equally costly, requiring movement through rubble-strewn terrain under constant observation by drones. Ukrainian defenders had exploited these characteristics deliberately. The defense was layered, with forward positions designed to absorb initial contact and to impose casualties, while their secondary lines provided depth. Minefields were laid to slow advances and to channel movements. Artillery was pre-registered on likely avenues of approach. The objective here was not to prevent every penetration, but to ensure that each advance came at a disproportionate cost. The Russian offensive began in early October 2023. With coordinated assaults on Avdiivka's northern and southern flanks. The attacking forces included elements of the 2nd and 41st Combined Arms Armies, as well as units of the 1st Army Corps of the Donetsk People's Republic, reinforced by mobilized infantry and storm detachments. Armoured assets included T-72B3 and T-90 main battle tanks, BMP-2 and BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicles, and MTLB carriers, supported by massed artillery. The Ukrainian defenders were anchored by the 110th Mechanized Brigade, supported by artillery units and rotating formations, with long familiarity with the terrain. From the outset, the fighting was intense. Russian mechanized columns advanced under heavy artillery cover towards the rail embankments and industrial zones controlling access to the city. They encountered dense minefields and pre-sighted kill zones. Armoured vehicles were destroyed or disabled in clusters, forcing infantry to dismount and advance on foot under fire. Casualties mounted rapidly. During mid-October, Ukrainian General Staff frequently cited Russian losses of several hundred killed or wounded each day during peak assault periods. While such figures cannot be independently verified in detail, Western intelligence assessments and open-source analysis of equipment losses confirms that Russian attrition was severe. Dozens of armoured vehicles were destroyed within the first weeks of fighting, and often in the very same limited areas, indicating repeated attempts to force progress along the same axes. But despite these losses, the Russian command did not pause their offensive. Instead, they adjusted tactics, signalling that attrition had been accepted as the price of their progress. As mechanized thrusts failed to produce a breakthrough, Russian tactics began to shift towards infantry-centric assaults, supported by overwhelming firepower. Artillery barrages lengthened, small assault groups advanced after hours of shelling, probing trenches and ruined buildings meter by meter. Drone reconnaissance became ubiquitous, allowing artillery to adjust fire in real time and making Ukrainian movement increasingly dangerous. This phase of the battle was defined by repetition. Assaults were launched, repelled, regrouped, and then launched again. Each attack sought incremental gains, rather than decisive breakthroughs. For Ukrainian defenders, their defense remained effective, but the cost of holding each position increased steadily. Evacuation of casualties became more difficult as drones tracked movement along supply routes. Wounded soldiers often waited longer for extraction, increasing the rate of fatalities even when positions were held. By November, Russian forces escalated their use of air-delivered glide bombs. Dropped from aircraft operating beyond the effective range of Ukrainian air defense systems, these munitions carried large warheads capable of collapsing reinforced structures. Sections of the coke plant that had withstood months of shelling were now damaged or destroyed. Ukrainian units were forced to abandon positions that had previously provided relative safety, shrinking their defensive depth. Reporting of casualties during this period continued to describe Russian losses in the high hundreds per day during this intense period of fighting. Western analysts assessed that cumulative Russian casualties in the Avdiivka sector were already substantial by late November, while Ukrainian losses, although lower, reflected the increasing danger of evacuation and resupply under constant observation. By December 2023, the battle had entered a new phase in which sustainment itself became the primary battlefield. Russian forces increasingly focused on placing Ukrainian supply routes under fire, rather than closing a perfect encirclement. Persistent drone surveillance turned roads into lethal corridors. Movement had slowed, evacuation windows narrowed, ammunition deliveries became sporadic. Ukrainian defenders could still repel assaults, but the margin for error had shrank. Each withdrawal from a forward position had to be calculated, not only in tactical terms, but in logistical ones as well. Delays in evacuating casualties had increased fatality rates, and exhaustion had accumulated. While the defense remained coherent, its endurance was being tested, not by the collapse at the front, but by the attrition in the rear. By the end of December, Western intelligence assessments had described the Avdiivka offensive as one of the costliest Russian operations of the war, with losses numbering in the many tens of thousands, both killed and wounded. Ukraine continued to hold the city, but the conditions that allowed it to do so for years were eventually eroding. January 2024 did not begin with a dramatic rupture of Ukrainian lines around Avdiivka, but with something more dangerous and less visible, because the balance between holding ground and sustaining their force began to tip decisively towards the latter. Russian forces entered the new year having accepted that Avdiivka would not fall quickly, and that success would depend on compressing the Ukrainian defense until the city could no longer be supplied or evacuated at a tolerable cost. The operational logic was no longer centered on seizing blocks of territory, but on making Ukrainian movement inside the city progressively more lethal, thereby turning the geometry of defense into a liability rather than an advantage. Russian pressure increased simultaneously on both the northern and southern flanks, with particular emphasis on positions that overlooked remaining supply routes. The objective was not to close a clean encirclement, but to establish consistent fire control over the roads and tracks that Ukrainian units had depended upon to rotate troops, move ammunition, and to evacuate their wounded. In a battle space saturated with drones, this approach was especially effective, because once a route was under persistent observation, artillery could be adjusted rapidly, and even sporadic strikes were sufficient to change behavior. Vehicles began to move only at night, longer detours were taken, and the time required for each resupply run had increased, compounding fatigue and slowing response times. Inside Avdiivka, Ukrainian units continued to fight effectively, but the defense had begun to lose elasticity. Positions could still be held, but repositioning between them became increasingly dangerous. Units that had previously rotated out after a set period were forced to remain longer under fire. Casualty evacuation slowed even further, and the difference between a survivable wound and a fatal one increasingly depended on whether evacuation could be attempted at all. This shift did not produce an immediate collapse, but it changed the character of the battle, because attrition was now being posed not only by direct combat, but by the degradation of sustainment itself. The most consequential developments in January occurred in the southern sector of Avdiivka, where Russian forces achieved a series of tactically modest but operationally significant penetrations. These advances did not involve sweeping armoured breakthroughs, but infiltration, pressure on fixed positions, and the exploitation of concealed approaches that bypassed some of the defenders' strongest fortifications. Once Russian units had established themselves in these areas, they were able to threaten internal movement corridors and force Ukrainian commanders to divert resources in order to prevent the defense from being split. One of the defining features of this phase was the capture of fortified positions that had anchored the southern defense for years. These locations mattered not because of their symbolic value, but because they controlled approaches and provided depth. When they fell or were abandoned, the geometry of defense changed rapidly, forcing Ukrainian units to withdraw from adjacent positions that suddenly risked being cut off. The result was a cascading effect, in which holding one position increased the danger to another, and the commanders were forced to prioritize preserving their force over holding every meter of ground. Casualty rates surged during this period. Ukrainian reporting frequently described Russian losses in the range of 700 to over 1,000 killed and wounded per day during peak assault cycles, particularly when Russian infantry had pushed aggressively to exploit perceived openings. Assessments by Western intelligence characterized the Avdiivka fighting as amongst the most casualty-intensive on the entire front during January, noting both the scale of Russian losses and the continued willingness of Russian command to commit fresh units despite them. Ukrainian losses, however, also increased, particularly during movements between positions and during evacuation attempts under drone observation, even as defenders continued to inflict disproportionate casualties on the attacking forces. The reason that January had proved so decisive lay in the cumulative effects of December. By the time the calendar had turned, Ukrainian defensive depth had already been reduced by glide bomb strikes that had collapsed hardened positions and forced withdrawals from areas that had previously been survivable under shelling. Roads that had once functioned under intermittent fire were now consistently targeted. Ammunition stocks inside the city were lower, evacuation times longer, and the ability to rest and reorganize units became more limited. This had meant that January's Russian advances did not need to be large to be effective. Each new position gained allowed artillery and drones to extend their reach. Each withdrawal shortened the distance between the front and the remaining supply routes. The defense was still coherent, but it was becoming brittle, because a system designed to trade space for time depends on the ability to move, and movement was increasingly being punished. By mid-January, Ukrainian commanders had faced a narrowing set of options. Continuing to hold Avdiivka would impose mounting casualties not only from combat, but from the inability to evacuate their wounded and to rotate exhausted units. However, withdrawing too early risked allowing Russian forces to claim an uncontested victory and to potentially exploit momentum. The balance between these risks would define the final phase of the battle. February 2024 opened with the same pattern that had defined January, but with greater intensity and less margin for error. Russian forces continued to press on multiple axes, maintaining pressure on remaining supply routes and increasing the use of air-delivered glide bombs against hardened positions. The effect of these strikes was cumulative rather than spectacular, because each collapse reduced the number of locations where Ukrainian units could shelter, rest, or stabilize casualties. For Ukrainian defenders, the problem was no longer whether they could repel assaults, but whether they could do so without becoming trapped. Fire control over roads meant that evacuation windows were unpredictable and often closed entirely during daylight. Vehicles that had stopped or broke down became easy targets. Soldiers increasingly moved on foot between positions, increasing exposure and fatigue. In such conditions, the risk of encirclement did not depend on a complete ring of enemy forces, but on whether the remaining corridors could be used at all. It was in this context that Ukrainian command made the decision to reinforce Avdiivka with one of its most capable formations, the 3rd Assault Brigade. The deployment was not intended to reverse the tide or to retake lost ground, but to stabilize collapsing sectors, counter infiltrations, and, most importantly, to cover withdrawal routes if a retreat became unavoidable. In modern siege warfare, elite units are often committed not to win the city, but to ensure that the force can leave it. As February progressed, attention focused on the southern strongpoints that had anchored Avdiivka's defence since 2014. Among these, the fortified complex, commonly referred to as Zenit, carried particular weight, because it had long denied Russian forces a direct southern approach. By mid-February, however, the position's strength had become a liability. With Russian forces pressing from multiple directions, and supply routes being under fire, holding Zenit risked trapping its defenders in a pocket from which evacuation might become impossible. The decision to withdraw from Zenit reflected the harsh logic of siege warfare, because abandoning a long-held bastion can appear as a setback, yet remaining in place under conditions of encirclement often leads to far greater losses. Ukrainian commanders chose to preserve personnel rather than terrain, accepting the immediate tactical cost in exchange for avoiding a catastrophic outcome. Therefore, Russian forces gained ground, but the withdrawal had denied them the opportunity to destroy a large Ukrainian formation in its place. This phase of the battle also produced some of the most dramatic casualty claims. Statements attributed to Ukrainian units, including the 3rd Assault Brigade, described extraordinarily heavy Russian losses and alleged the effective destruction of entire Russian brigades. Russian sources, meanwhile, circulated their own accounts of massive casualties and intense fighting. While such figures cannot be treated as precise or fully verified, their convergence around the idea of extreme losses on both sides indicates the intensity of combat during this period, when forces were concentrated in shrinking areas, and movement itself became deadly. By mid-February, the strategic question for Ukraine had become unavoidable. Holding Avdiivka no longer promised to impose costs on Russia that exceeded the risks to the defending force. The remaining supply corridors were under consistent fire control, evacuation was increasingly unreliable, and the danger of encirclement was no longer theoretical. In such circumstances, continuing to fight for the city risked transforming a costly defence into a disaster. On the 17th of February 2024, Ukraine's commander-in-chief ordered a withdrawal from Avdiivka, explicitly framing the decision as one made to preserve lives and to prevent encirclement. This order did not mark the end of the fighting, but the beginning of one of the most dangerous phases of the battle, because disengagement under fire, particularly in a drone-saturated environment, is often more lethal than simply holding the trench. Russian forces moved quickly to claim control of the city, presenting the capture as a major victory after months of fighting. Meanwhile, Ukrainian units began a complex withdrawal, including rearguard actions, counterattacks to keep corridors open, and rapid movement under artillery and drone threat. Vehicles were abandoned where they couldn't pass. Some units broke out on foot, and in places, wounded were left behind because evacuation was impossible. These are not signs of collapse, but of the brutal realities of withdrawal under pressure. In the days following the order to withdraw, fighting continued as Ukrainian units disengaged, and Russian forces attempted to disrupt the retreat. Reports emerged of temporary encirclements, breakouts under fire, and chaotic movements through ruined streets and fields. The 3rd Assault Brigade and other formations played a critical role in covering these movements, absorbing pressure and allowing larger movements of the defending force to escape. Casualties during this phase were significant, though difficult to quantify. The concentration of forces, combined with heavy artillery and drone strikes on movement routes, meant that losses occurred not only in direct combat, but during attempts to evacuate, reposition or regroup. The difference between survival and death often depended on timing rather than tactics, because a route that was passable at night might be closed by morning, and a pause to rest could draw a strike. By the time Russian forces had consolidated control over Avdiivka, the city had been reduced to ruins. The civilian population had long since fled, infrastructure was destroyed, and the terrain that had once offered defensive advantages was now a wasteland of collapsed buildings and cratered roads. Russia had achieved its objective in territorial terms, but the cost had been immense. The capture of Avdiivka removed a long-standing Ukrainian position near Donetsk, and allowed Moscow to claim a tangible gain after months of attritional fighting. Yet the victory did not produce a strategic breakthrough. Russian forces were exhausted, equipment losses were severe, and the ability to exploit the capture operationally was limited. Ukrainian forces, though battered, preserved much of the defending force, and withdrew to prepared positions, stabilizing the front rather than allowing a collapse. In military terms, Avdiivka demonstrated the realities of modern siege warfare. Artillery and drones dominate. Logistics and evacuation determine endurance. Fortified cities are dismantled over months rather than days, and victory is measured not only in ground taken, but by forces preserved. For Ukraine, the defense of Avdiivka imposed enormous costs on Russia and delayed its advance, even as the city itself was lost. For Russia, the capture of Avdiivka came at a price that constrained what could follow. Avdiivka's fall did not end the fighting around Donetsk, nor did it resolve the broader conflict in eastern Ukraine. What it did, however, was to clarify the method that would likely define future battles. Slow compression, fire control over supply routes, the systematic destruction of defensive depth, and withdrawal before encirclement becomes destruction. In that sense, Avdiivka stands not only as a battle, but as a template for siege warfare. This city, which held for nearly a decade, fell not because its defenders could no longer fight, but because the cost of staying far exceeded the value of holding. Thank you for watching today's video. If you found it informative, please leave a like or a comment down below. All of our content, from the research and script writing to the editing and narration, is completely human-driven, without the use of AI. So if you want to support our channel, consider subscribing, and use the bell icon to get notifications on when the next Wars of the World video is released. Thank you for watching.